The teller's name was Marisol. I know that because I'd been banking at that branch on Cedar Street for 9 years, and Marisol had been behind that window for most of them. She had a way of remembering things, my grandkids' names. The fact that I liked the small bills for church collection. The fact that my wife Donna had passed in the spring. She never made a show of it. She just remembered, the way people do when they actually see you. On a Tuesday morning in November, I walked into First Heritage Bank on Cedar Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma at 9:40 in the morning and asked to withdraw $2,500 from my checking account. I needed it for a roof repair, nothing dramatic. Just an old man doing an old man errand on an ordinary weekday. Marisol smiled at me the way she always did. She asked for my ID. I handed it to her. She typed something into her computer, looked at the screen, and then she stopped moving. Not the pause of somebody double-checking a number. The other kind of stillness. The kind where a person's face is trying to stay professional while their eyes are doing something else entirely. She looked at that screen a beat too long. Then she looked up at me, and her smile was still there, but it wasn't doing the same job anymore. "Mr. Whitfield," she said, "could you give me just 1 second?" She picked up her phone, turned halfway away from me, talked low enough that I couldn't make out the words, just the shape of urgency in her voice. She hung up, turned back, and said, "Someone's going to come talk with you in just a moment, okay? Just hang tight for me." She said okay, and for me in that particular tone people use when they're trying to keep an old man calm, without telling him why he needs to be calm. I said, "Marisol, what's going on?" She said, "Mr. Ordway's going to come out. He's our branch manager. Just give him 1 second." I'd spent 40 years running an HVAC and sheet metal business before I sold it and retired. 40 years of reading contractors, reading subs, reading which guy was about to tell me the job was behind schedule before he'd actually said a word. I know what it looks like when somebody's walking you toward bad news real slow so it doesn't knock you down all at once. I stepped off to the side of the counter and waited, the way you wait in a dentist's office when you already suspect what the X-ray's going to say. The lobby kept moving around me. A young mom with a stroller, an old fella at the counter arguing gently about a returned check. The ordinary hum of a Tuesday morning in a bank that had no idea anything was wrong. About a minute later, a door opened to my left, and a man in his 40s came out, trimmed beard, company polo, the particular walk of somebody who's been told exactly how serious to look. He put his hand out. "Mr. Whitfield. Greg Ordway, branch manager. You mind stepping back to my office a minute?" "Not at all," I said. I followed him down a short hallway into a back office with a window that looked out over the parking lot and a desk set up with 2 monitors, one angled just so, like it had been arranged for conversations exactly like this one. He shut the door, sat down, turned one of those monitors toward me slow, like a man who'd rehearsed how he was going to do it. "Mr. Whitfield, I want to show you something before I tell you anything," he said. "At 7:52 this morning, someone came into this branch and made a cash withdrawal against your checking account. Full available balance. $18,610. He let that hang there a second. It came with a signed withdrawal slip. Signature matched yours close enough on the first pass that the teller processed it. Our fraud system flagged it about 20 minutes later on a routine review, which is why I've got you back here now, instead of finding out about this at 3 o'clock. He clicked his mouse. The screen filled with a security camera feed, time-stamped 7 hours, 52 minutes, and 14 seconds. Clear as day because this branch had gotten new cameras the year before. A woman at the counter. Tall, dark blonde hair pulled back into a low bun. A green wool coat I would have recognized in a crowd of 500 people, because I bought her that coat myself 2 Christmases back. It was my daughter. I sat there looking at that screen a long time. Greg Ordway had the good sense not to say a word, not to move, just to let me have the silence, because some silences aren't meant to be filled by anybody but the person sitting in them. Finally, I said, real quiet, "That's my daughter, Renee Whitfield Kessler." He said, "Yes, sir. That's what we suspected, given the account history." I said, "She's not on that account. Never has been." He said, "No, sir. It's solely in your name. The signature's a forgery, best we can tell. We've put a fraud hold on the transaction, which means the money hasn't fully cleared. Right now it's frozen." Frozen. I sat with that word a second. I sat with everything underneath that word, and everything I'd already been carrying for the better part of a month, building toward exactly this moment. I said, Greg, I want to thank you for how you've handled this. I need to ask you one thing. Is the cash still recoverable? He said, it was dispensed, but the hold means it can't be moved or deposited anywhere else without triggering another flag. Far as the system's concerned, it's frozen in place pending the fraud review. If you file a police report today, we can start the formal recovery process on our end. I said, I'm going to need the withdrawal slip, the transaction record, and a still image off that camera. He said, I can have all that ready inside the hour. Thank you, I said. I leaned back in that chair and looked at the frozen picture on his monitor. My daughter, in her green coat, standing at my bank at 7:50, 2 inches the morning while I was at home, feeding my dog and reading the paper, having no idea in the world what she was doing across town. But here's the thing she didn't know. Here's the part that changes everything you're about to hear. What Renee didn't know when she walked into First Heritage Bank on Cedar Street at 7:52 that Tuesday morning was that 4 weeks earlier, I'd already moved every real dollar I had to a different bank across town. That $18,610 sitting in that account wasn't my savings. It wasn't my life. It was the exact amount I had decided I could stand to lose if it meant proving what I already knew was happening. Because I'd known for a month, and I'd spent that whole month getting ready for this Tuesday. My name's Walt Whitfield. I'm 68 years old. I live outside Tulsa, Oklahoma, on 11 acres my wife and I bought back in 1987 when it was nothing but red dirt and a promise. The road that brought me to that chair in Greg Ordway's office cost me $18,000 in frozen cash, and 40 years of running a business where the invoice either adds up or it doesn't, and there's no version of a man's feelings that changes the math. My daughter made the same mistake everybody who tries to take from their own family eventually makes. She figured that because I was old, and alone since Donna passed, and grieving, that meant I wasn't paying attention. I'm always paying attention. That's the whole job of being an old man who used to run a company. You learn to watch the numbers, because the numbers don't lie to spare your feelings the way people do. Now let me back up, because you need to understand how a man gets to a place where he sets a trap for his own daughter. I ran Whitfield Heating and Air for 38 years out of a metal building on the edge of Broken Arrow that I put up myself with 2 employees and a used truck. By the time I sold the business in 2019, we had 6 trucks, 14 employees, and a reputation across 3 counties that I built 1 honest bid at a time, 1 warranty call answered on a Sunday at a time, 1 customer who came in mad about a bill and left satisfied because the number I gave them was the actual number. I went looking for a trade where the work either held up or it didn't, and I found it, and I built a good life on top of it. Donna and I raised 2 kids on that 11 acres, my son Cole, and my daughter Renee. Cole is 41 now, lives up in Bartlesville with his wife and their 2 boys, works as a lineman for the electric co-op, and calls me every Wednesday night and most Sunday afternoons. He drove down 3 separate times in the 2 months after his mother died, without me asking him once. And never not one single time in his whole adult life has he asked me a question about money, or the property, or what I plan to do with either. He's got his mother's plain kindness. He'd also told me, twice in the past year, quiet and without any accusation in his voice, that he was worried about his sister, and that I ought to keep my eyes open. I heard him. I just didn't move fast enough on what I heard. Donna died in April, and by the first week of June, that's 6 weeks. For those of you counting the way I eventually started counting, my daughter had asked me 3 separate times about the state of my will. Renee is 44. Lives in Owasso with her husband Trent and their teenage son. Trent works in commercial insurance and has the specific manner of a man who's calculated exactly how much charm a room requires and delivers precisely that much and not 1 ounce more. Firm handshake. Remembers what team you root for. Asks the right question at Thanksgiving. In 11 years of being my son-in-law, he has never once said a single unrehearsed thing in front of me. Renee's my daughter, and I love her the way you love a child who's made choices you wouldn't have made and turned into somebody who's harder to be around than you hoped for. She's sharp. She's capable. And those 2 things had been pointed in a direction for years that I'd noticed and refused to say out loud, mostly because Donna always told me Renee would find her footing eventually, and I generally deferred to Donna on matters of the heart, because she was better at people than I ever was. Donna was gone, and 6 weeks later, Renee started asking about the estate. The questions came dressed up nice. She was worried, she said, because a friend of hers had lost a parent without an updated will, and it turned into a mess with the siblings, real ugly. And she just didn't want that for our family. She mentioned Trent had some background in this kind of thing through the insurance world, and would be glad to look over any paperwork if it'd help. She mentioned, just once, almost like an afterthought, that the 11 acres were probably worth a good deal more now than when we bought it. What with the way Broken Arrow and Owasso had both grown out toward us, and that it might be smart to understand the tax side of things before anybody made any decisions. I told her I appreciated her looking out for the family. I did not tell her that a man who spent 40 years pricing labor and materials down to the dollar knows the difference between a daughter who's grieving alongside him and a daughter who's running numbers. It was Cole who said something first, that July. He called me on a Wednesday and, after we talked about his boys and the co-op in the garden Donna had left behind that I was making a mess of, he got quiet and said, "Dad, I don't want to start anything, but has Renee been asking you about money?" I said she had. He said, "Just watch that. That's all I'm saying. Watch that." I told him I would. I meant it, but I still let another 6 weeks go by doing nothing but watching. The way you watch a storm on the horizon and tell yourself it might still turn north. It didn't turn north. In September, I spent a week going through my own accounts with the same care I used to bring to a commercial bid, every statement, every login, every notification I'd ever ignored because I figured the bank would tell me if something was wrong. I found two things. The first was that my personal checking account had been logged into from an IP address in Owasso, Renee, and Trentstown at 3:14 inches the morning on a night in July. 4 minutes, no transactions made. Just somebody looking around with my password. The second thing was an inquiry on my credit report I hadn't made. A pre-qualification pull for a home equity line against the 11 acres, submitted online in my name back in August. It hadn't gone through, because I'd had a credit freeze on my file for years out of plain old business habit, and that freeze had stopped it cold. But the inquiry was sitting right there in black and white. August. Same month Renee had asked me, real casual, whether I'd ever thought about unlocking some of the equity in the land. I sat at my kitchen table a long time with those two facts in front of me. I ran a business for 38 years. I know what it looks like when a number doesn't match the story somebody's telling you. I'd been filing this particular feeling away for months, in that drawer where you keep things you're not ready to call by their real name. I was ready to call it by its real name. Next morning I called a lawyer. Her name was Carol Jean Aldridge, 61 years old. Practiced elder law and estate matters out of an office above a barber shop in downtown Tulsa, which I mentioned because the address tells you something. It wasn't fancy, it was working, and I've always trusted the working kind more than the fancy kind. A fellow from my old Rotary Club had sent 2 people her way over the years, and described her as somebody who doesn't like surprises. Neither do I. I walked into her office on a Monday morning with a legal pad full of notes, printouts of the login record and the credit inquiry, and a copy of my will, which Donna and I had drawn up back in 2015, and never touched since. Carol Jean read through everything without saying a word, the way the good ones do, no gasping, no dramatics, just quiet reading. When she finished, she set it all down and looked at me straight on. "Mr. Whitfield," she said, "I want to ask you something plain. Based on what's in front of me, do you believe your daughter is working toward taking something from your estate before you're gone to take it?" I said, "I believe she's already started. That login and that credit pull aren't coincidences. That's scouting." She said, "And your son?" I said, "Cole's warned me twice. He's not part of whatever Renee's doing. I'd stake my life on that." She said, "What outcome do you want?" I said, "I want what's mine to go where I decide it goes. I want Renee to understand that I knew exactly what she was up to, and that I'd already handled it before she got far enough to do real damage. And I want it all on paper, because I spent 40 years learning that the paperwork is the only thing that still tells the truth once everybody's finished talking." Carol Jean looked at me a long moment. "Those are things we can build," she said. "Let's talk about how." Over the next 2 weeks, we moved. I opened a new account at a bank across town, Prairie Trust, out on the highway, a place Renee had never once set foot in, or had any reason to know existed. Every dollar of my actual retirement, every certificate, every account that mattered, got walked over there quietly, one transfer at a time, spread out so nothing tripped an alert on either end. What stayed behind at First Heritage was the checking account Renee had grown up watching me use, the one whose number she'd have had 100 casual chances to memorize over the years, sitting there at $18,610, enough to be worth stealing, small enough that losing it wouldn't have broken me if that's what it came to. I also called the branch and asked to speak to somebody in fraud prevention. Got a woman named Denise Okafor on the phone, told her plainly what I'd found and what I expected was coming, gave her the account number, told her what to watch for, and asked her to flag it for extra monitoring and call me the second anything moved. Denise Okafor said, "Mr. Whitfield, in my 19 years doing this job, I believe I've gotten maybe 4 calls like this one in my whole career." I said, "Well, I expect I'm the 5th. Then I did the hardest part. I waited. I kept having Sunday dinner with Renee and Trent and my grandson like nothing had changed. I let her ask me, twice more, about the will, and I told her the same thing both times, that I was still thinking it through, still grieving, still not ready to make big decisions. I watched her nod along with a patience that, once you know what you're looking for, doesn't look like patience at all. It looks like waiting. The Tuesday it happened, I was home doing exactly what an old man does on a Tuesday morning: coffee, the dog, the paper, the crossword Donna used to do half of before handing it to me. I had no idea my daughter was 40 minutes away, standing at a teller window in a green coat, signing my name on a piece of paper. Marisol's training is what caught it. "That's a fact I want," said Plain, "because I've read enough comment sections under stories like this one to know somebody always wants to blame the teller. Marisol didn't fail me. Marisol is the reason this whole thing has an ending instead of a hole in my savings. She flagged the transaction the moment something about the signature didn't sit right with her, quiet as could be, without tipping off the person standing right in front of her, and got the fraud team moving inside 20 minutes. That's not incompetence. That's a young woman doing her job exactly the way it's supposed to be done." Back at First Heritage that Tuesday, after Greg Ordway had shown me everything and I'd asked for my copies, I drove straight to the Tulsa County Sheriff's substation and filed a report. The deputy who took it, a young man named Deputy Ruiz, listened to the whole thing without interrupting once, and at the end he said, "Sir, I've taken a lot of fraud reports. This is the first time I've taken one from somebody who already had the whole thing documented before it happened." I told him that was the job I used to do: get ahead of the number before the number gets ahead of you. The investigation moved through the fall. First Heritage's internal fraud team pulled the security footage, the forged withdrawal slip, and matched it against the login records from Owasso back in July. Denise Okafor's monitoring flag had logged the exact minute the withdrawal slip was presented, time-stamped alongside the camera feed, which meant there was never a single hour where the facts could be argued with. When the detectives got a warrant for Renee's phone, they found something I still think about most nights. A Notes app entry, time-stamped 2 days before the withdrawal. Dad's balance still sitting at $18,610 at First Heritage. Trent says due it Tuesday morning before he's up, in and out by 8. She'd been watching that number for months. She'd built a whole plan around a Tuesday morning she thought belonged to her, and she never once considered that the building she was walking into had already been waiting for her for a month. Trent, when it all came out through text messages between him and Renee that the detectives pulled, hired his own separate lawyer from Renee's, and gave a statement describing his involvement as general awareness of what she was planning, nothing more. Deputy Ruiz told me about that phrase with the particular flat tone of a man who's heard general awareness plenty of times before, and has a strong private opinion about what it actually means. Renee was charged in December with theft, forgery, and financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, that last charge stinging worse than I expected it to. Hearing myself described that way in a courtroom document, even knowing every word of it was true on paper and false in every way that mattered to me personally. She didn't call me between the morning at the bank and the day the charges were filed. I didn't call her either. Cole called every Wednesday like always, and we talked about his boys and the co-op and Donna's garden, which I was slowly learning to keep alive the way she'd have wanted, and we mostly left Renee out of those calls, because there wasn't anything useful left to say about it that wasn't already sitting in a case file. I went to see Carol Jean in January to go over the whole estate structure one more time and make sure everything held. She confirmed the 11 acres and everything real were sitting clean and untouched, completely outside anything that could be reached by what Renee had tried to do. I asked her, "And the 18,000? She said, "Recovery's underway through the bank's fraud process. Given the hold and the strength of the evidence, First Heritage has indicated they expect to make you whole. Might take a few months." I said, "I put that money there knowing I might lose every dollar of it if that's what it took to prove what was happening. I never expected to see it again. Getting it back is better than what I planned for." Carol Jean looked at me a second. "Most folks in your position don't think about it that way," I said. "Most folks in my position didn't spend 40 years pricing jobs for a living." She almost smiled at that. Renee took a plea in the spring, guilty, full restitution, a suspended sentence with probation, and a permanent mark on her record that no amount of charm from Trent or anybody else was ever going to talk away. The restitution came through that summer. I deposited it into the account at Prairie Trust, and wrote the date down in the same notebook I've kept records in since 1987, out of habit more than need at that point. Then I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee and just sat there a while with the fact that it was finally over, which is a different kind of sitting than sitting in the middle of something. Takes a different kind of quiet to get through. Cole drove down that weekend. We sat out on the back porch in the June evening, and he helped me figure out what Donna had been growing along the fence line by the garden, a plant I couldn't place from her notes alone. He remembered because she'd told him about it once, years back, and he'd just held on to it the way he holds on to things. He said, "She planted that because the finches come through in the fall for the seeds. She used to say it was specific to certain birds." I said, "I've been trying to figure out how much water it wants." He said, "Less than you'd think." She wrote that down somewhere. We found the page later. She had. "Less than you'd think." That was Donna, precise right down to the margins of her own notebook. We talked about Renee once that evening, for maybe 10 minutes, the way people talk about something that's settled but not really finished. Cole said he still couldn't fully wrap his head around how far she'd let it go, and I told him I figured it came down to the same thing. Most of these stories come down to she believed I wasn't paying attention anymore. And that belief felt comfortable enough to her that the whole plan turned real in her head before she ever stopped to consider what paying attention actually looks like on a man who spent his whole working life pricing other people's mistakes for a living. He said, "She should have known you better than that." I said, "She knew me 20 years ago. She just never bothered updating the file." He said, "That's a real particular way to put it, Dad." I said, "It's the only way I know how to put things anymore. The garden's coming along. Not the way Donna had it, I don't have her eye for it. Never will, but better than it was a year ago. I've been following her notes as close as I can, learning things now that I should have learned while she was still here to just tell me straight. That fence line planting put out its seeds right on schedule in October, same as she said it would, and I stood at the kitchen window 3 or 4 mornings, running and watched the exact birds she'd meant for show up and take them, one after another, same as clockwork. She'd have liked that. Not surprised by it, just quietly satisfied, the way she got when something she'd planned carefully finally worked the way she'd planned it. That's how she built things. Not just for the day she was standing in, but for the day after, when she wouldn't be standing there anymore and somebody else would need it to hold up without her. I built my paperwork the same way, if I'm honest with myself. Not for the morning I needed it. For the morning after, when having it all in order was the only thing standing between me and losing everything twice over, once to a daughter, and once to not having the sense to see her coming. 40 years of pricing jobs down to the dollar, and it turned out the last job I ever priced was my own family. The number came out the way the truth always does, whether you want it to or not. If any part of this sounds like your own family, or your own worry about somebody you love getting older, I hope you'll do what I didn't do fast enough. Trust the feeling in your gut the first time it shows up, not the fourth. Tell me in the comments where you're watching this from tonight. And if this one hit close to home for you, hit that like button before you go. I'll see you next time.